Hi, and welcome to the 70th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to talk about modern Oman. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the rules, here they are. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. That said, this will be a secular presentation trying to give a perspective that is not biased in favor of one side or another. And of course, like all topics, this will be controversial, so let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If you want to ask a question auditorily, we can wait till the end, and then you can raise your hand, and then I will call on you. What I like to say is that these classes will be a 101 and a 201. 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. And I'll have a 2-hour hard stop. So if I don't cover everything that I intend to cover today, that's okay. Those will be rolled over to the next time we meet, which will be in 2 or 3 weeks because I'm taking a vacation. So if you see dates below a person, those are either their dates of service or their years of life. If it's the years of service if they are a political figure. It's their life if they're a philosophical figure or a business person or somebody who doesn't have a specific political title. And this, like all the other episodes in this Middle Eastern history series, can be watched later. You can also see all of the other presentations that we do. All of them will be on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you find this interesting. And we also appreciate PayPal donations. So I wanted to start with sort of a reprise of some of the things that we've learned about Oman, either directly or indirectly. And when we talked back in episode 3 about the Arabia that preceded Muhammad's birth, one of the things that we mentioned is that the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, where Oman is situated, is directly within the ancient fighting sphere of proxy wars between the Ethiopians in the west and the Persians in the northeast. And Oman was almost exclusively in the Persian zone of influence because all of these wars between the Persians and the Ethiopians took place in Yemen, right? You had King Abreha, who was appointed by the Ethiopians over Yemen, and then you had a number of Persian rulers like Khosrow I, Shahanshah, King of Kings, who ended up expelling Abreha's son, Masruq, from Yemen and forcing them back into Egypt, bringing Yemen back sort of into a more Persian sphere by the end of the 6th century. And so just before Muhammad, you can see that Oman is clearly within the Persian sphere. And there's a point that's worth making is the modern country of Oman, in that it is the easternmost part of the Arabian Peninsula up to the Strait of Hormuz, is a current manifestation of Oman. Historically, Oman was that, as well as what we call today the United Arab Emirates. So all of that territory was considered Oman, part of the Omani coast, and that differentiation we're going to see over time is going to have a very important effect in the relationship that it has with some of its neighbors, especially the United Arab Emirates itself. We also saw that with the Battle of Muta in 629, that Muhammad sent a letter to Heraclius, Emperor of the Byzantines, to invite him to Islam, basically saying that this was a true religion, that he should embrace it, and if he did not embrace it, then his kingdom was no longer for this world, and that the Muslims would sweep them underfoot. Heraclius, of course, responded to this letter the way that any large-scale leader would respond to the letter of an incipient paramilitary group outside of its borders, which was to laugh at and throw it in the garbage. Now, there are different Islamic stories as to how Heraclius acted, that he at first thought that it was a great idea, and then later he, in the presence of his officials and courtiers, he decided to reject it. But whichever way it went down, it was not well received. The Omani tradition is that they also received one of these letters. And the letter to the kings of Oman, Jaifar and his brother Abd, both Al-Jalandis, they agreed to submit to Islam and to bring Islam into their borders. So the relationship between Muhammad and them was a peaceable one. And in fact, Omanis were part and parcel of the Arab armies that expanded outward from the peninsula in the conquest. That's not to say that there wasn't resistance within Oman to the acceptance of Islam. And we see that during the Ridda Wars. If we remember, the Ridda Wars occurred between the years 633 and 634. Right after Muhammad died, there were a number of apostates, or murtad, where the word Ridda comes from, who left Islam, and Abu Bakr spent the majority of his reign of 2 years fighting a civil war to bring these groups back into the political and religious fold of Islam. And while most of those battles occurred in what is today Saudi Arabia, a few of them occurred in what is today the United Arab Emirates, which, of course, as I mentioned, was part of the historical area of Oman. So you can see, for example, the grave of 10,000. This is in Dibba, in Fujairah. Fujairah is the easternmost part of the United Arab Emirates. It's very close to the border, actually, with Oman, and it's called the grave of 10,000 because 10,000 Muslims died fighting, or supposedly 10,000. I think it's one of those round numbers, like 40 days was the amount of time that Moses was on Sinai, or one of these sort of numbers. But 10,000 martyrs died trying to bring Oman back into the fold, which it eventually did come. And we have to also go back to our discussion of Islamic sects, which we did very early on. And I do this because not over 95% of the Muslim world today divides between the Sunni and the Shiite. And those are the two groups that we hear about constantly. But that less than 5%, that sort of rounding error in the worldwide Islamic population, is actually really important when it comes to the discussion of Oman, because Oman is if you see on the far right-hand side of this graph, under Khawarij, you have the word Ibadiyya, and Ibadiyya is the dominant form of Islam in Oman. It's debated what percentage of Omani residents are Ibadi. Low-end estimates put it at 45%, high-end estimates put it at 75%. Regardless of that, it is the dominant, in a political and social perspective, form of Islam in Oman. And it's important for us to understand, what does it mean to be Ibadi, and how does that relate to the Sunnis and the Shiites? So we're going to sort of discuss a little bit about that. So if we go a little bit forward in time from where we were to the 650s, we have a civil war that breaks out in the Rashidun Caliphate. Ali, who was the fourth rightly guided caliph, is trying to maintain power. He's been appointed through a representative council, or shura, in the wake of his predecessor Uthman ibn Affan's death. Now, Uthman's cousin Muawiyah, who was governor of Syria, presses Ali on the question of who assassinated Uthman, and to continue the investigation and to give him an answer as to what happened. Now, there are debates, depending on whether you take the Sunni or the Shiite perspective, as to whether he was doing this from a genuine desire to understand more about the situation, or he was doing this from a political propagandistic point of view to demonstrate Ali's incompetence. The former view being the Sunni view, the latter view being the Shiite view. But because of this, there was a civil war that ended up happening between Muawiyah and Ali. And after several battles, they met at the Battle of Siffin, and they had an arbitration. And this arbitration is the source of the Khawarij, meaning the outsiders. So let's talk a little bit about this arbitration that happened. So after the Battle of Siffin happens in 657, Ali sends his representative, and Muawiyah sends his representative, and the two of them agree that in private that they're going to say that both Ali and Muawiyah made a mistake in going to war, and that they should both stand down and renounce their title of authority. And Ali's representative goes first, and he says the statement that, that both parties were responsible. And then Amr ibn al-As, governor of Egypt, who was Muawiyah's representative, turns around and says, "Oh, you expected me to say something?" And this collapses the entire possibility of the arbitration. And those who were in the Khawarij argued that Ali was not of sound mind to have even gone into an arbitration. He was winning the Battle of Siffin. He was in the moral right. And at a fundamental level, Ali was in a situation where he had traitors at every turn. He had people, even in his own military, who were advising him badly. For example, after the Battle of Siffin, his generals advised him to go after these Khawarij, after these outsiders, people who broke away from Ali after the arbitration, instead of going after Muawiyah. Note that the Khawarij, these outsiders, were taking a neutral stance in the war, meaning that they weren't going to support Muawiyah and they weren't going to support Ali. In fact, they were opposed to both of them. But they went after the Khawarij. In fact, at the Battle of Nahrawan, which is in modern-day Iraq, they killed a number of Khawarij families in the area. And then those same generals, when Ali ordered them to attack Muawiyah's strongholds in Damascus, they decided to not do that. So from the Khawarij perspective, Ali, who had been somebody they had supported up to the Battle of Siffin, demonstrated consistently that he was not a leader who was interested in what was right and true in the Islamic context, that he wasn't pure enough of mind and of spirit to really lead the Islamic people, the Muslim community, sorry. And as somebody who couldn't lead the Muslim community, he needed to be either removed or some new authority needed to come to power. Now, of course, they didn't agree with Muawiyah either. They considered Muawiyah even worse than Ali. And so they stayed more or less separate from the two sides in that civil war. But one of the survivors of Nahrawan, who saw many of his family members been killed, Ibn Muljam, he assassinates Ali in 661, and therefore brings an end to the Rashidun Caliphate, bringing up and allows Muawiyah to end up ascending and creating the Umayyad dynasty. And there's an important piece that we have to understand here about the relationship between these groups as religious identities and as political identities. While today we talk about Sunnis, Shiites, Ibadis, and other Muslim sects as religious identities where people believe different things about the nature of reality, in the beginning, they didn't start out that way. They started out as political divisions based on who would lead the Muslim community. And so each one of these groups had a different idea of how that would manifest. And the Ibadi perspective was on who should lead and what the rituals should be was further impacted by the Umayyads and how they decided to govern. So Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan comes to power and he establishes this dynasty. And the idea that he establishes a dynasty was new in the Islamic perspective, because previously rulers were generally chosen through a consultative process. So the idea of hereditary monarchy, although significantly more stable and therefore something that came to be favored by Sunnis, was seen as an anathema to the Ibadis. Furthermore, you can see by the constructions that the Umayyads made, like that palatial mosaic, like the mosaics in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, the Umayyads built grand buildings. They lived a very expansive life, a very expensive life as well. And this was seen by many of the Ibadis as an innovation, an alteration of the rules that Muhammad had brought down from God. And accordingly, these were people who were violating the fundamental religion they were supposed to be protecting. Never mind, of course, that the Umayyads themselves were incredibly tyrannical. They punished their dissidents through torture, through execution and murder. They, at least in the Ibadi view, were monarchs no different than non-Muslim monarchs. They didn't deserve to be the stewards of this large empire. However, because of their small size, people who felt this way among the Khawarij, because Ibadism hadn't been founded at this point, but the people who would become Ibadis were part of the Khawarij, they saw the Umayyads as themselves being outside of the tradition because of how they were behaving, rejecting austerity and behaving in a very cruel way towards their subjects. And we see them revolt at the end of the Umayyad period in 745, when Marwan II, who was the Umayyad Caliph at the time, was dealing with significant amounts of instability elsewhere in his territory. And at this point, we have a chance meeting between two individuals. You have Abdullah ibn Ibad at-Tamimi, who is the namesake of the movement, right? Ibadi. And he gives the philosophical backing to this idea of standing against authoritarian figures, standing against abusive figures, and for a return to a more traditional Islamic situation with consultation, piety being the centers of life. And he meets up with Abdullah ibn Yahya al-Kindi, who was also known as Talib al-Haq, or the seeker of truth. And this seeker of truth began to operate throughout the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, starting in Hadramaut, which is in today the eastern part of Yemen, controlling significant parts of Yemen as well, and even taking the cities of Mecca and Medina before Marwan II was able to marshal his forces and directly go against Abdullah ibn Yahya. So this is the first time that the Ibadis are able to take some kind of political power and actually demonstrate the kind of theology that they were espousing. And they made a clear distinction between themselves and other Khawarij groups, like the Azarqa and like the Najdad. And the particular difference that they made is that they argued that political assassinations, like the type that Ibn Muljam had made against Ali, were no longer acceptable. If a ruler had lost the right to rule, he should be deposed peaceably, not forced out militarily. But the short-term victory in at least the southernmost parts of Arabia was not to last. Yahya al-Kindi was able to make an alliance while he was alive with Al-Julanda bin Mas'ud al-Azdi, the king of Oman. And the king of Oman effectively became the first Imam. He was elected by the Shura process. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is in a second, to be the first Imam, the first spiritual leader of the Ibadi people. Now, there's an important point to make here, that Imam in the Shiite and Ibadi traditions means something very different than it does in the Sunni tradition. In the Sunni tradition, an Imam is the leader of a local religious area, right? Similar to a priest or a pastor in the Christian tradition, or a rabbi in the Jewish tradition. We're talking about a very local level ruler. The Imam in the Shiite and Ibadi traditions is the forerunner of the faith, the effective pope, if you will, of that version of Islam. Now, Al-Julanda managed to be the Imam for 2 years before he was deposed but not by choice. The Abbasids, as we remember, invaded in 750 and overtook the Umayyad Caliphate. And if the Ibadis thought that the Abbasids would be any better, they were quite quickly shocked to discover that they weren't. The first Abbasid king called himself As-Safa, meaning the bloodletter, because he invited 70 Umayyads, the entire Umayyad family, save one person who managed to escape, to a feast. And at that feast, he locked them all in and then killed them all. So given that this is a movement that thoroughly rejects assassination as a political tactic, the murder of an entire family was something that was completely unacceptable. And the Abbasids then made the physical move to take over Oman, which they subdued in 751. So now I have the question of how did Imams get deposed? And this is part of the Shura system. So Shura is often translated as election or consultative assembly, but that's not exactly what it is. The different tribal leaders of different clans who are represented in the Ibadi world, based on their power and their connections, will sit together and discuss the situation and come to a consensus solution. A consensus solution means that it's not majority rules and then the majority gets what they wanted. Everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to agree on whatever the solution is, which means that debates can take a very, very long time. And unsurprisingly, there are periods when the resolution just doesn't happen, when there is no clear succession. And while this works for a spiritual movement, it doesn't necessarily work for a political one, which is something that we're going to see in a bit. But one of the things that this consultative assembly allows to happen is when there is enough rancor in the leadership of the various different tribal affiliates, they can demand that the Imam step down. And since the Imam's power comes through the Shura, in fact, the Imam is required, whenever he wants to make a decision, to consult the Shura. His power can be taken from him because of how connected he is to that council. And we have a number of situations throughout the history of Oman where the Imam has been deposed, and it may even be that there's no Imam for a few years before the Imam, before a new Imam is chosen, because of all the political wrangling and all the consensus building that any particular new Imam would have to do in order to get the role. And it's not just a popularity contest. The Imam has to demonstrate two serious capabilities. The first one is that he is militarily capable, as was shown by the defeat of Al-Jalanda. An Ibadi Imam has to be able to protect the Ibadi community, or else they will be overrun by the powers of larger Sunni or Shiite groups. And so if push came to shove and they absolutely needed a ruler, they should choose one based on military ability for that reason alone. But in any other moment, what was critical is also that this person be an intellectual, an alim, a scholar. And this scholar would be a person who could understand the meaning of the Ibadi traditions and be able to expound in a meaningful and salient way. In fact, the Ibadis came up with hadith collections, for example, by their Imams before the major hadith collections were published by the Sunnis or the Shiites, for exactly this reason. Their Imams were studied and relatively educated individuals, even among the different clans. One of the fundamental differences between the Imam in the Ibadi tradition and the Imam in the Shiite tradition is that the Imam in the Shiite tradition is entirely hereditary. In Shiite Islam, the Imam could only be a person who was descended from Ali ibn Abi Talib. And you can see, for example, the Shiite line of succession up to the 5th person. And of course, some Shiite lines of succession, like the line of succession for the Nizari Ismailis, is in their 49th person in that line of succession, just son after son after son after son after son, all the way down the hierarchical tree. In Oman, there are certainly cases where the Imam has passed down from father to son, but it's much rarer than here, because each Imam is representative of the group of tribes that was responsible for getting that person promoted to the position of Imam. And so what you end up seeing is certain families get picked multiple times rather than certain individuals' direct lines. We also see the MENA, or the Islamic Inquisition, that occurred during the reign of Caliph Ma'mun, the third caliph of the Abbasid dynasty. And al-Ma'mun argued that the Mu'tazila philosophy, that the Quran was created, as opposed to the dominant view in Ash'ari philosophy, which is that the Quran is eternal, that it is a part of God himself, was the correct view. Now, Mu'tazila tended to operate according to a more rationalistic understanding of the universe. And in many ways, the Ibadis agreed with this doctrine of createdness, that the Quran was a created thing, that God made it at a certain point in time, and that while it has God's speech and that has an incredible holy value, it doesn't have any divine essence, and it's certainly not extemporaneous. While agreeing with the Mu'tazilites on this issue, they absolutely opposed the way that Ma'mun imposed his view of Mu'tazilism, mainly this Islamic Inquisition, where he brought up individuals who disagreed and subjected them either to imprisonment, torture, or death. Ahmad ibn Hanbal got the first two, not the third. And he is actually the founder of the Hanbali school, which is the dominant school of Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia today. So, just as a point of interest, Ibadi philosophy at this point begins to differentiate itself from Sunni and Shiite philosophy. It accepts occasionalism, which is similar to those, but it also rejects the physicality of God, which is a Sunni view, that at the end of days, people will actually see God's hands and God's legs and all these other appendages. And as I pointed out, they accepted the Mu'tazilite doctrine of the Quran's createdness, as opposed to the dominant Sunni philosophy today, and the dominant Shiite philosophy as well, of the Quran's uncreatedness. They have a different view of predestination than any of the different Muslim groups, which preserves a certain degree of free will. And one of the biggest differences that they have, actually, with Sunnis in particular, is that they believe that hell is eternal. The Sunnis believe that after you have been in hell for a time commensurate with your sins, you will be released and permitted to go to heaven. The Ibadis reject this. And ironically, Ibadis say that the fact that they know that they'll go to hell forever if they are sinners, because Ibadi sinners will go to hell, it makes them be more tolerant in this life, makes them be kinder in this life, knowing that there is no reprieve if they don't. Now, after Oman was conquered and made part of the Abbasid Caliphate, there were a number of Ibadi evangelists who made their way to Northern Africa, in particular to the Algerian region of Mzab. And the Mzab people are a group of Sanhaja, Amazigh, or Berber people, and they created their own small empire in rejection of the power of the Abbasids, especially that far attenuated from their centers of control in Baghdad. And this was either called the Tahirt or the Rustamid dynasty, and they primarily expanded and created wealth through their trade with sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, this region of parts of Algeria, parts of Tunisia and Libya, are the only areas with a significant Ibadi population outside of Oman. So then we get to 700 years after that point. And we see that the Portuguese are expanding their power into the Indian Ocean through their different trade routes that they discovered. And in particular, their battles with the African city-states of Azania along the eastern coast of Africa, and their battles with the Indian powers in Gujarat, specifically the Battle of Dio in 1509 and 1515, resulting in being able to found their own Indian city-state of Goa. And the Portuguese also established numerous ports along the Persian Gulf in much of the territory of Oman. Much of modern Omani self-conception, therefore, is of their self-liberation from the Portuguese colonization. In particular, the Portuguese are famous in an Omani context for being incredibly abusive, resorting to violent acts, sexual subjugation, enslavement. And so the Omani resistance in the form of Nasser bin Murshid was a resistance to this and a restoration of traditional Omani culture. Now, Nasser bin Murshid was the Imam between 1624 and 1649, where he began to put together all the different tribes of Oman in order to coordinate a resistance to the Portuguese. And that resistance actually worked too well. The Omanis were able to themselves replace the Portuguese as the dominant power in the western part of the Indian Ocean, expanding into territory that is today part of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Iran, Pakistan, and along the Azanian coast. That's Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and even Mozambique. You ended up having the Omanis even creating a second capital on the island of Zanzibar, which they used as a massive slave exploitation zone, selling and buying slaves throughout the Indian Ocean region to consumers in both the Islamic world and in the Christian world. In terms of wealth generation, a number of the territories that had come under Omani control in Africa were directly connected to interior areas in Zimbabwe, for example, that were massive gold mining areas. And so gold and diamonds made their way to the Swahili coast, as it was called, or the Azania coast, and into Omani state coffers. Now, it's worth remembering that Zanzibar was an area that was effectively an Arab colony. It had a number of Arab leaders who ran the entire political schema, and a larger population of Africans who were subdued and subservient towards their rule and organization. We had a quick Persian invasion in 1737 under Nadir Shah, where he intervened in a civil war between the Yaraba claimants. And basically the result of the war was that Ahmed bin Said AlBusaidi was able to consolidate power, push the Persians out, and therefore create his own dynasty. And this AlBusaidi dynasty is in fact the dynasty that rules Oman to this day. So the Omani government has been in the form generally that it is now for over 250 years. One of the large-scale changes that occurred in the beginning of the 19th century is that the British began to have an investment in controlling the Indian Ocean. And the reason for that, of course, was that their trade with India was booming due to the colonization and imperialism towards that country. So one of the biggest impediments was that there was a significant amount of piracy in Oman, in particular on what they called the Pirate Coast, which you can recognize as the coast of the United Arab Emirates today. In particular, closer to the northern part, near Ras Al Khaimah, you have the Qasimi Sheikhs. And the Qasimi Sheikhs were pirates that regularly attacked British shipping. Now, from the Qasimi perspective, they were patrolling their own waters, which the British were constantly violating because they didn't provide proper payment and understanding to the groups that were already there. So the British actually launched an invasion of Ras Al Khaimah in 1819 and forced these various tribal leaders in what was at that time Oman's private coast to sign a unique treaty with them, which was called the General Maritime Treaty of 1820. Now, this treaty is very interesting from an Omani perspective, because Oman, despite it being the legal power in that area, this was the coast of Omani territory. Oman was not consulted, nor was it involved in the negotiation, signing, or ratification of this treaty, which is very odd, because it's very rare that an international treaty will be accorded between the domestic subjects of one country and a foreign power. And in fact, the Emiratis, who are the descendants of these people from the pirate coast, have argued that this treaty effectively meant that Britain was recognizing these states, which were at that time called the trucial states, because they were subject to this maritime treaty or truce, that these trucial states were now independent of Omani power. And this created a sense of unease in Oman of how their country might be split apart, how their country might be disassembled. We also see Oman entering a golden age in the early 1800s, where they begin to be involved in the large-scale clash of powers between the British and the French, and they managed to choose the British side. They sent embassies to a number of different countries, including the United States. You can see the Sultanate entering New York Harbor in 1840. That was the first time Arab dignitaries had met Americans on American soil. And the Omanis began to become more powerful as a result of the British trade that was being facilitated in the Indian Ocean. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. So, and one of those big things, of course, that was buoying up a significant part of the Omani economy was the slave trade. And when the British started to ban the slave trade and force the Omanis in 1875 to stop trading slaves, it was a massive hit to their economy. Another more salient hit, perhaps, was that the British intervened in an internal Omani dispute. Majid and Thawani were two Omani brothers who both believed that they inherited the Sultanate. They both inherited the title of power over both Oman and Zanzibar. And the British resolved their dispute by splitting the countries between them. So Zanzibar became one sultanate and Oman became another sultanate. There's a question about the 1840 meeting with the Americans. The 1840 meeting with the Americans was primarily social, economic, and cultural. There were no conflicting claims between the United States and Oman. The United States in 1840 was a thoroughly isolationist state, and the Omanis saw a relationship with the United States as a possible trade opportunity, which it ended up being in a much smaller degree then and a much larger degree now. And the British began to further entrench their power in Oman after the split by posting their navy all along the Omani coast. It's worth talking at this point about the religious diversity within Oman, the cultural diversity within Oman, because it's a sort of a unique situation relative to a number of the other Middle Eastern states. And it's because Oman was so connected to these international trade routes, because it was so connected to this outside of the Middle East dimension, if we can call it that. there were a number of Indians who had come to take up residence in Oman. And these were Hindu believing Indians. There were also Muslim Indians who came to Oman, but it's particularly telling that we know as early as 1517 that there were Bhatia merchants. These come from Western India, the region of Sindh, who took up residence in Oman and became part and parcel of the Omani community. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been issues. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a pogrom against the Indian community that basically almost eliminated it. But the Indian community has come back and rebounded. And they have experienced freedom of religion for the most part in the territory of Oman, which, remember, the Hindu religion, according to Islam, is a form of shirk, or a form of apostasy that is punishable by death. And which is why you don't have toleration for polytheistic religions throughout much of the Islamic world. But in Oman, the rulers turned a blind eye given the relationship that many Omanis had with the Indians, the long term of their settlement in Oman, and their contributions to the naval trade, the maritime trade with India and along the Azania coast. They built their own mandirs, their own temples. And while a number of Muslim countries have given permissions to Christians or Jews to build synagogues or churches, it's much rarer to find permission to build this kind of structure, given the fact that there are divinities inside of it. A particularly interesting other piece is the recognition of citizenship. Now, it's very difficult for guest laborers in Oman to get citizenship because of the kafala system, which we've seen in other cases in other Gulf countries. In particular, we saw Egypt on the recipient side of the kafala system. But since a lot of the Hindu population in Oman was in Oman for centuries, they are Omani citizens. And so you have the rare situation where you have a person like Kanaksi Khimji, who was a leader of the Indian community in Oman, receiving the title of Sheikh in addition to his citizenship that he already had. And that meant that he is the only Sheikh in the entire Middle East who is a Hindu by religion. He was primarily responsible for the formulation and improvement of the large number of Indian schools, which have been available in Oman since 1975. And I believe that there are over 33 such schools throughout Oman. As Oman moved into the early 20th century, it faced the rise of a new power in the Arabian Peninsula, and that being the Saudi state. And the Saudi, while they initially didn't push back against Muscat and Oman, their philosophy of Wahhabism was fundamentally opposed to that of Muscat and Oman. And also, it was increasingly unclear what the relationship was going to be between the Saudis and the British. If that relationship turned in any way negative, it was likely that Muscat and Oman would find themselves as proxies in a war against them because of their connection to the British and their increasing dependence on the British. One of the things I want to note is actually, if you look at the map on the lower right-hand side, you see that there's a large white area between the areas controlled by the Najdis, or the Saudis in green, and the territory of Muscat and Oman. And that is the Rub al-Khali, or the empty quarter, where practically nobody lives. And that provided some degree of a buffer between the territories of Muscat and Oman on one side and those held by the Saudis. But a number of treaties concluded between Percy Cox, who was one of the foreign secretaries of the United Kingdom, and the Saudis, actually began to argue where the borders more or less were of the various other states in the region, which solidified Saudi control of the Rub al-Khali, of the empty quarter. Now, during World War II, Oman's primary contribution was to serve as a British forward base. There were a number of Spitfires made in Oman and flown by either Omanis, but more often by British commanders based there. In particular, these were used to deal with a number of the battles that took place in Iraq, to oversee the transport of petroleum up through Iran to the Soviet Union, and other surveillance tactics in this part of the world. And of course, World War II also solidified the Saudi-American alliance, which would be a guarantor of safety for Oman as well, given that the Americans and the British were, for the most part, on the same side. If we turn the clock back a little bit and talk about the 1920s, we can see that this British influence in Oman was becoming incredibly pervasive. During the reign of Sultan Timur bin Faisal, the British controlled nearly every aspect of defense policy, every aspect of foreign relations, numerous internal pieces like currency production. And effectively, the Sultan couldn't make a decision without the British input, which alienated a significant portion of the Ibadi leadership. In particular, Salim bin Rashid al-Kharousi was an imam, an Ibadi imam, and he began to lead a groundswell of opposition to this rulership. And he started based in Nizwa, which is an internal city. If you look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see a mountain range that runs along the coast of Oman. On the coastal side were the British and the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman. And further inland on the other side of that mountain range was the territory that they could not control because of these revolts all across the southern, all across the interior of the country, where people were more traditional and where people wanted a sense of independence. In fact, this situation would remain because the Omanis simply didn't have the military capability to exert over the mountains. And so in 1920, the Imam and the Sultan signed what was called the Treaty of Sib, where there wouldn't be a delineation between two countries per se, but within Oman, the Sultan couldn't impose his will over the mountains, and the Imam couldn't do the reverse, meaning that you effectively had two different zones of sovereignty for two different groups of people. But of course, this was going to change when the British began changing what they primarily wanted Oman for. Now, we've discussed that Oman served a pivotal role in Britain's positioning around the Indian Ocean, in particular, its connectivity with India itself, and its connectivity at this point with its African territories. But if what Britain wanted out of Oman was access to the coast, then a coastal territory is what would suffice. But increasingly, it became a serious question as to whether or not there would be oil within Oman. And when that came to fruition, the sites that looked the most promising, especially as we enter the late 1940s and early 1950s, are sites deep within Imamate-held territory, deep within territory hostile to British interests. And to exploit these resources, a new organization was created in 1937, the Petroleum Development of Oman, or the Sharikat Tanmiya Naft Oman. And it's at this point that it's worth taking a step back for a second and remembering the difference between medieval states and modern states. Up until the 1950s, Oman was pretty solidly a medieval state. It had attenuated power. A lot of the power that was at least nominally held by the Sultan was subject to the jostling of power between different tribal leaders. Certainly in the Imamate region, the Imam was subject to the policies of Shura, and therefore was required to be subordinated to his nobles to a certain degree. There was no clear bureaucracy. In fact, if there was a bureaucracy of any kind, it was the British bureaucracy. The military itself was based on regional militias, in both the case of the Imamate and in the case of Oman. And we're even talking about a few hundred or a few thousand people fighting in any particular battle. The borders are extremely vague. In fact, many of the borders of this part of the Middle East were settled in the last 70 years rather than based on some long-standing negotiation. And it's the reason why many of them are exact and straight. And of course, religion was a huge question about concerning state legitimacy, given that the Imam of Ibadi Islam was literally in opposition to the Shah in terms of political power. And I want to sort of dig a little deeper into these border issues. So I made this map on the right-hand side of areas of control and power, and you can sort of see that this is a much more accurate map of what the region would have looked like in 1950. Those sort of brown areas being areas where very few people live, and so there's very few centers of power or projection. But of course, this also meant that there were areas that were heavily contested, especially if we're talking about the border between Oman and the United Arab Emirates, if we use that term anachronistically, because of the fact that the United Arab Emirates only came into existence because of that weird treaty that was signed with the British in 1820, that desisting from piracy. And so one particular example is the city of Al Ain. And you can see the majority of that city is on the UAE side of the border. But the city of Al-Buraimi is a clear part of Al Ain, but it's on the Omani side of the border. And it's because different tribal allegiances meant that certain regions felt more connection to the Sultan of Oman, and certain regions felt more connection to the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi. And so you have this dispute that boils over in 1954, not even just between UAE and Oman, but the Saudis believe that they might have a right to Buraimi. And as Sultan Said bin Taimur is collecting his forces to go to Al-Buraimi, he needs the British support. And the British decide they want to try and negotiate with the Saudis, and they leave him high and dry. In fact, he actually has the British address his soldiers and explain to them why they're not going to go to Al-Buraimi, because he is thoroughly angry by this possibility. Never mind, of course, the difficulties that are also happening, because the Treaty of Sib means that there's some degree of border between the Sultanate and the Imamate. You also begin to see that the Imamate is seeking international recognition, separate from the Sultanate. In this era of increasing decolonization and independence for different peoples, a regime like the Sultanates, which is effectively a colonial administration with British advisors, was much less desirable in the international scene than an autonomous entity that was ruled primarily by its own people, self-determining. However, given the British position in the United Nations and its Security Council, and given the lack of funding that the Imamate really had and the lack of exposure to the international world that the Imamate had, the Imamate couldn't advocate for its cause very effectively within the United Nations. There's a comment that maps detailing the tribal territories of this region look almost like a Jackson Pollock painting. Even today, there are 3 parts of Oman. That's absolutely true, yeah. So, as part of the British effort to expand Omani power into the regions where oil could be more easily accessed. The PDO, the petroleum uh, Petroleum Development in Oman, gave funding to Said ibn Taymiyyah to build a more expansive armed forces. And this created the first modern military within Oman's history. And that force began to try and attack over the mountains and into the territories held by Imam Ghalib and other individuals loyal to the imamate. And by and large, the territorial advantages of the imamate counteracted the modern troops for a significant period of time. And the war only turned decisively in the favor of the Omanis in 1959, when the British Royal Air Force, based from Muscat, started doing its own aerial raids and bombings, in addition to those done by the Sultan's armed forces, and resolved the war decisively for the Omanis. Now, the imamate was understanding the moment that they were in throughout this period, throughout this Jabal Akhtar war, the War of the Green Mountain. And so they reached out to Saudi Arabia, they reached out to Egypt, and in fact, the Nasserism of Egypt during this period was to them a beacon of hope. The Nasser in 1956 had ejected the British with regards to the Suez Canal. He was able to create Arab-run institutions in opposition to Western powers. And there were intents within the Arab League to escalate the power of the imamate, but these did not go very far. Because at the end of the day, Oman was not a high priority for them when they were dealing with Israel and Yemen and other sorts of issues in the 1950s. One of the ironies of the Jabal Akhtar war is that the Saudis began to help arm the imamate as part of this outreach from Nasser, from other individuals to the Imams to a certain degree. And so the Saudis were providing American-made weapons to the imamate in order to hold back the Sultan's forces, and the Sultan was using British tanks, which of course were American tanks that had been sold to Britain. So American bombs were blowing up American tanks in a war fought by people who had no direct relationship to the United States at this point. Now, the 1960s also really sees the end of the late 50s and early 60s sees the end of what we can call the Omani Empire. We have Oman with a presence on multiple continents, even though it's two different states, the Sultanate of Zanzibar and the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman. Remember that Oman extends into the heart of Africa. And they do this ruling from their island of Zanzibar. Now, of course, by this point, the rule in Zanzibar had been significantly circumscribed to that island, to that island and a few others in the archipelago, because of the British colonization of Tanganyika, taking over from the Germans in 1919, and the British colonization of Kenya and the Italian colonization of Somalia. But something earth-shattering happened in 1964, which was called the Zanzibar Revolution, where the African population of Zanzibar, who were the majority, overthrew the Arab leaders of Oman, the Zanzibari Omanis. And once they were expelled on the 12th of January, the leaders of that revolution began a campaign against all Arabs and South Asians. They were given an explicit order by their leaders not to target whites who happened to be on the island, which made the British and the Americans feel a lot better about their citizens residing there. But what ended up happening was a targeted set of ethnic cleansing against those populations, the Zanzibari Omanis, and against any South Asian, any Indian that was living with them. There are debates in circles as to whether this was a genocide or whether it's an ethnic cleansing or whether there's some degree of both, but all of the tools of genocide that people are familiar with in a low technology context, such as systemic rape, brutal violence, murders in the streets, beheadings, hunting down people building by building. All of these things happened in the Zanzibar Revolution. And so many of these Zanzibar Omanis tried to migrate to Oman. And when they did, they were in fact incredibly useful, especially when Sultan Qaboos comes to power in 1970. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the Zanzibar Omanis were disproportionately well educated, disproportionately organized in a way that the population in Oman under more direct British tutelage was not. The other major group that became part of Oman in a way that they really hadn't before were the Balochis. Now, Oman controlled territory in what is today Pakistan, the city of Gwadar, and they ruled it as an effective city-state under their control. Think of it like the Hong Kong of Oman. Now, Gwadar was in an ethnic Balochi region of Pakistan, because Pakistan is a multi-ethnic country. And these Balochi had, for a certain amount of time, actually been part of the Omani system. Because they had no tribal loyalties, since they were not part of the various jostling tribal factions, they could be recruited to the military of the Sultanate, and they would have no conflicting loyalties about going to war with any specific tribe or any specific group, meaning that they were very useful from that perspective. Additionally, Balochis were a Muslim group, and so conversion wasn't necessary. They weren't Ibadi by religion. Most of them were Sunni or Shiite. But the differences between Sunnism and Shiism were never a serious issue to the Ibadis of Oman. And so they were able to practice their religions freely. In 1958, for about $3 billion, I believe, the Omanis sold Gwadar to Pakistan. And you can see Malik Feroz Khan Noon, a representative of the Pakistani government, declaring Gwadar to be part of Pakistan as a result of that land purchase. And finally, another group that contributed to the growth and development of Oman, starting in the 60s, but really picking up in the 70s, were Arabs from elsewhere in the Arab world, especially Egyptians. In the early part of Oman, in the early part of modern Oman in the 1960s and 1970s, Egyptians made up nearly half of Omani school teachers. Other groups like Jordanians made up an additional fifth. And so there's a question of what is the current relationship between Oman and a lot of African countries. Oman has relations with a number of African countries, but they are not very well developed. Most of those relationships are related to the fact that Oman is an oil exporting country, and so these countries are oil importing countries, and therefore they trade. But there's no defense alliances, no integration initiatives, no reconciliation commissions. By and large, Oman has turned away from Africa and come a lot more focused on the Persian Gulf region. There's a comment here which I think is really helpful. I served in Oman in the early 90s, and the Zanzibaris were key officials throughout the government. Absolutely correct. They spoke perfect English and I think Swahili at home. In many cases, they spoke Swahili or Arabic. So they were fluent in all three in many cases. Some were working on improving their Arabic. There you go. Omani ambassadors to the US were often Zanzibari in origin, thanks to their excellent English. Yeah, exactly. So if we're looking at the wider Gulf, we start to see the conflict that begins to brew between the Nasirites and the Saudis. And we've seen that in Yemen, where you had the Yemeni civil war. We saw that with the Nasirites trying to overthrow the kings of Saudi Arabia with the Al-Murabitun and other political parties that are Nasirite leaning. And we see in 1967 the success of the independence movement in South Yemen, leading it to become a Nasser-aligned socialist/communist country. And so we can see that Oman is going to sit within this larger conflict of Arab socialists versus Western-aligned monarchies. And of course, the Sultanate is very clearly a Western-aligned monarchy. It's functionally controlled by the United Kingdom. And the Imamate is going to fit into more of that Arab socialist independence-minded perspective. And that's why we're going to see conflicts against the Sultanate arising from support from groups like Nasser's Egypt, who are interested in advancing that sort of more Arab independence-minded agenda. And probably the best place to see this is in Dhofar. So if you look on the map, you can see Dhofar is in the far western part of the territory Oman controls. And I want to draw your attention to the population density map. You can see that most of the areas between Dhofar and Muscat have practically no population. And in fact, prior to the 1980s, there wasn't even a road that connected Dhofar to Muscat that was at all usable. And so in order for people to get from Muscat to Dhofar, they would actually take boats. It was more effective to get through an entirely land-connected country by using boats. And it's not that the territory was hard to cross, just there wasn't the mechanism for crossing it, it just hadn't been built. The second thing I want to draw attention to is that Dhofar is a very unique region within the wider Middle East because it is a mountain range that captures the monsoon winds. And so the area is very lush. It's historically been used for the growing of frankincense. And you can see pictures from Dhofar, you would swear you're looking at an Indian jungle as opposed to an area in the Arab world. It is that kind of different in terms of the vegetation that develops there. And the third thing that's really interesting is that the indigenous inhabitants of Dhofar are not Arabic speakers. Arabic speakers did move in there, and so there's a large percentage of Arabic speakers there now. But the local hill tribes or Jabali people speak a number of South Arabian languages. These are languages that are more closely related, for example, to the languages of historic Yemen and the languages of the Horn of Africa than they are to Arabic directly. And we then have to sort of see what this Dhofari conflict is about. Dhofar had been ruled by Sultan Said bin Taimur, almost like his own personal fiefdom. He took significant advantage of the people. He did not give them any recourse to health or other sorts of benefits. And especially starting in the 1960s, he began to become incredibly reclusive. We're going to talk a little bit about that soon. But because of this, the people in Dhofar were sick of this mistreatment and they wanted to find some remedy to secure a better livelihood from them. And given that they were so cut off from Muscat, they felt like that distance could work in their favor. Combine that with a Nasserist organization called the People's Front for the Liberation of Occupied Asian Gulf, which you can see the flag up there, the PFL-OAG. This organization was a communist and Nasserist organization made to liberate the territory of Oman and other Gulf monarchies and make them Nasserist states in a socialist model. And so you have support coming from the Yemeni border, which you can see is literally right there. And you have support coming from Saudi Arabia to a lesser extent because they want because they don't support the Omani Sultanate after it removed the Imamate in 1959. And you even have parties from further afield. Both China and the Soviet Union get involved on the side of the communists, of the Faris. On the flip side, you have the Omani forces which were thoroughly incompetent, and they needed the British in order to guide them from the SAS. The situation was incredibly difficult and dire, and the British knew that if they wanted to prevail, that they would need to have a more forward-thinking monarch. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the the coup of 1970. But you can see from the propaganda that the British were placing that the message that they were trying to send is that the hand of God will crush communism. And there you can see the Omani emblem on the hand, and it's crushing the communism. Never were promises made to the Fadi people under the reign of under the reign of Sultan Said, because he didn't want to change anything. He wasn't willing to change anything. And just to show the absurdity of Sultan Said, he painted his own palace windows so nobody could see into them. And of course, he couldn't see out of them. He required people to walk around with lanterns all the time. He banned smoking in public places. He banned leaving the country or entering the country. Basically, if there's any way for people to have fun, he banned it. He even locked the major cities of the country, so people couldn't leave them without express permission. And it got to a head when his son, Qaboos, was hidden in one of the palaces, Al-Husn Palace in Salalah, which is actually in Dhafar. And Qaboos got a message out to the British. He had gone to school at Sandhurst in the United Kingdom, and so he had a number of British contacts. And those British individuals launched a coup to get him out of his imprisonment and dethrone his father and bring his father to the United Kingdom. Now, of course, for 40 years, the United Kingdom denied its involvement in the coup, and the face of the coup was the governor of the Dhafar. But effectively, it meant the British put Qaboos in power, and Qaboos served their interests and the interests of Oman more generally. So what ends up happening here is that on the 23rd of July, 1970, Qaboos comes to power, and he comes forward with a massive initiative in order to deal with the problems of the Dhafar. In particular, what he's going to do is actually improve the livelihood of the people and grant them a certain degree of rights and autonomy. You can see, for example, this was an initiative that was started before the coup, but it was greatly expanded by Qaboos, of giving medical treatments to the people in Dhafar and providing them with a better income. In fact, joblessness was a major problem within Oman when Qaboos took power in 1970. One of the things that we didn't talk about when we talked about the war was that after Qaboos came to power in 1970, he began to seek support from other Arab countries in order to help deal with the situation in Dhafar. He had an extensive war chest that Said had built up for him, just built up and never spent it. And he spent it on building a new navy and an enhanced military. But even then, and even with the British, he wasn't able to fully stamp out the PFL-OAG. And so he made an alliance with the Shah of Iran. And the Shah of Iran sent Iranian soldiers starting in 1973 to Dhafar, which helped put down the rebellion in 1976 and secured Oman from a wartime perspective. So we then see Qaboos trying to engage in a number of different reforms and improvements of Oman. And over the course of his 49.5-year reign, he was able to do an incredible number of different initiatives and and actions in order to move the country forward. The first one is that he put down paved roads. The country practically had no paved roads of any kind, and he built massive highways, interconnectivity. He built he built shipping lines. He built modern boats. He built large-scale harbors. He electrified the country. He built numerous schools. When he inherited Oman, the education system was very ineffective and ineffectual. By building the schools and using all that imported labor from the Zanzibaris, from the Arabs from other countries, he was able to vastly improve the academic standards of the Omanis. He also created an Omani national identity by the creation of Omani traditional clothing. That's not to say that Omanis didn't have traditional clothing that they wore during the time that Qaboos ascended to power in 1970. But by choosing a single national clothing, he was able to create a national identity, which is something that had been sorely lacking in Oman throughout its previous history. And that united identity allowed for a greater reconciliation of these various warring parties, be they the Imamate before 1959, the Faris before 1976, and so on. And he also wanted to foster a new sense of civil society and contact. So he permitted people to move around the country, which his father had banned. And he further created places for them to meet and work together. He created large-scale shopping centers and malls where people could hang out and spend time. He allowed foreigners to come and build their own companies and their own sales areas in multiple languages, so people got familiar with the diversity both within the country and further afield. We also see Sultan Qaboos pursuing an interesting economic behavior, which is that he had significant wealth from the oil that was being extracted by the PDO. And starting in 1970, the British gave more and more larger and larger percentages of the ownership of the PDO to the Sultan, such that by 1976, he owned 60%, and that's basically where it stays today, with Shell and a number of other private companies holding that remaining 40%. But that amount of money needed a way of getting to the population. And so instead of giving it as a welfare stipend, what he decided to do was simply expand the government, create numerous new ministries, and hire Omani citizens in those ministries. And so he used jobs in that way to create a bigger economic middle class in the economy. And he further used that now you had all these individuals working for the government, he could allocate them to different projects. And this led to a large scale of central planning to create modern industry, central planning to create modern communications, central planning to create modern service culture, modern tourism, especially tourism, ironically, in Dhofar because of its unique climate. And you have Oman spending he had this ability to see all of these long-term benefits, and he substantially improved the lives for many Omanis through this system. Now, he also made sure that the Shura tradition of Oman was reinstated, and so he tried to bridge the difference between himself and the Imamate, which had been the source of that war in the 1950s. And he did that through several different things. The first one was that he required himself to be subject to the Shura, and he created the Consultative Council, and those kinds of parliamentary bodies were required to provide laws and to advise him on policy before he was able to issue a decree. He also created a religious ministry, which incorporated the Ibadi Islam into the governing apparatus of the Sultanate. And in particular, he chose for this religious leadership Ahmed bin Hamad al-Khalili, who was the son of the second to last Imam. Ghalib himself didn't leave any, died in Saudi Arabia in exile. And there is no current Imam of Ibadi Islam, but Ahmed bin Hamad al-Khalili is probably the closest thing that could be possible to that role within the Omani structure. And because it's in the Omani structure, as opposed to outside of the Omani structure, you don't have the situation of Egypt, for example, where you have a secular government continually repressing the only Islamist alternative. That Islam is part of the government. That Islam is the official religion of Oman, and that religious views are promulgated by the government, centralizes religion in a way that we've only ever seen in one other example, which is Turkey. And in the case of Turkey, it's from a purely control perspective, but this allows religion to have an influence in the state because of its involvement in Shura. Now, it should be made clear that despite all this consultative ability that Qaboos has acquired to himself, you have a situation where the power that he would give to other ministers was significantly less than he would give in a situation where they could actually have a say or they could actually have power. And so he aggregated to himself the positions of Minister of Finance, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as being Sultan, which meant that he was abroad a significant portion of the time. But it also meant that he had power over the key basic fundamentals of the state. And so it made it impossible that even with all the jostling and the different tribal clans and the different groups, that nobody could undermine him. That said, that throughout his reign, he was incredibly popular and incredibly beloved because of how he modernized Oman and changed people's living standards. So there wasn't really any political threat to him because nobody could gain the public's appreciation quite like he could. There are two things that I sort of want to focus on in terms of the external relationships of Oman. And the first one is the Omani relationship with Iran. Now, a lot of that relationship was forged in 1973 when Iran supported the Sultan when nobody else would. And even though the government of Iran obviously changed in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, Oman considered that relationship to be intact. And so Oman maintained a favorable connection to Iran. Now, as I pointed out, the Omanis wanted to balance their relationship with the Americans because the Americans were now inheriting the world order from the British. The British had been pulling out ever since the 1960s, late 1960s, from the Middle East under increasing budgetary pressure within London. And as a result of that, Oman needed to find a new way to coordinate its security, and it chose to coordinate it between the United States and between Iran. So we can see, for example, that the Omanis reached out to the Iranians on strategic regional coordination, trying to maintain peace in the Persian Gulf, which has been one of Oman's chief goals to avoid the disastrous situations of the 1950s and 60s. And so when Iran invaded islands that the UAE claims, which are the Greater and Lesser Tunb Islands, in November of 1971, the Omanis didn't say anything negative about it, despite it being a violation of the international order. They also haven't said anything negative about Iran or Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. And in fact, the Omanis were one of the key sites where negotiations between Iran and Iraq could take place, given Oman's neutrality on such issues. Similarly, the Omanis extended that diplomatic reach again in trying to connect the Americans and Europeans with the Iranians on the nuclear issue, leading to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, which was commonly called the Iran deal in the United States concerning its nuclear weapons or possibility of acquiring them. And you can see there Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, meeting with John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the United States, at the time in 2014 to discuss that JCPOA. Iran and Oman have also tried to intensify their economic relationship, which has been a little bit more difficult. In 2013, they signed that they would send an undersea natural gas pipeline to Oman, which Oman would then be able to use in its industry as well as ship to third-party consumers. In effect, this would get around the Iranian sanctions and shows a reason for Iran to invest in the relationship with Oman and for the Omanis to invest continually in Iran. There's a comment that the Persians built the qanats all those years ago, and so it's interesting that these kinds of canals are being built by other Arabs today. And yes, I agree. It's very interesting that the times have changed on that. Okay. The other major relationship I wanted to examine is the relationship between the Emirates and Oman. Now, remember that the Emirates were originally part of Oman, that were sort of initially sectioned off by the British in 1820 with that treaty, and have sort of become their own independent entity. But because of this, you have weird border situations. For example, you can see if you look towards where that arrow is pointing, you have an Omani enclave sitting within the Emirates, and then within that enclave is an Emirati enclave, which means that the relationship between the two countries has to be relatively fluid. And in fact, there's freedom of movement for Omani and Emirati citizens in each other's countries. So that doesn't cause a significant issue, but you should see how complicated these borders are in terms of understanding the relationships between these different sheikhs. And the borders between these different countries are primarily based on the tribal allegiances that existed when those states became independent. Now, the UAE had difficulty coming together because the various emirates other than Abu Dhabi were afraid of coming under Abu Dhabi's control. Abu Dhabi has significant oil reserves, and they also have significantly larger size and clout. But the removal of the British presence from the region and that invasion of the Greater and Lesser Tunb in 1971 made the Emirates feel the need to actually come together. As a result, the United Arab Emirates formed actually in relation to the situation that they saw themselves in against Iran there, and the Saudis trying to push towards Al-Buraimi. In order to stabilize the region, the Omanis put together the Gulf Cooperation Council, which would serve to bring together all of the different states around the Persian Gulf, with the exception of Iran and Iraq, in order to negotiate the future situation and avoid these kinds of military hostilities. At the forefront of its policy, Oman seems to be trying to create regional stability and avoid further conflagration. Now, this can further be seen during the contentious dispute with Qatar between 2017 and 2021, where the Saudis decided that the relationships that Qatar had been cultivating with Islamic State, with the Taliban, with a number of other internationally decried terrorist organizations, were relationships that it was not willing to abide. There are those who argue that this was more in relation to Qatar's rapprochement with Iran, which Saudi Arabia had considered an enemy in their negotiations over oil extraction. But regardless of whether it's the former or the latter reason, or perhaps even both, the Saudis basically cut Qatar off from their airspace and their land access, which made Qatar functionally an island that was more or less impossible to escape. And you can see how long the detours would need to take in order to get out of the region, given that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis all were participating in this cut of ties with the Qataris. Now, as you can notice from that map, Oman is a country that did not break off relations with Qatar. And they tried desperately to reinstate the Gulf Cooperation Council and to bring Qatar back in line with the other Arab countries in order to facilitate the reemergence of peace and prevent a larger scale humanitarian catastrophe. There's one last piece that's, of course, important to talk about, and it's the succession. So Sultan Qaboos himself died in January of 2020, and he was a single child himself, and he left no descendants. Now, there are debates about whether or not this is because he was gay. There is no direct evidence that says that he was gay, but he only had a wife for a very short period of time, about 3 years in the 70s. And those who knew him seem to indicate that he was. It's also the reason why in Oman, as compared to a lot of other Middle Eastern states, homosexuality is punished by only 3 years imprisonment and rarely ever enforced, as opposed to Saudi Arabia and Iran, both neighbors of Oman, that have the death penalty for it. But because he had no children and because he had no brothers, there was a serious question as to who would succeed him in power. And his view was that it should be decided by Shura, but if they couldn't come to a decision themselves, he had left a name in an envelope as to who he thought would be the best candidate. So, of course, rather than discuss it amongst themselves, they pretty much just rushed to open up the envelope, and they saw that he had chosen Haytham bin Tariq AlBusaidi to be his successor. And Haytham has basically chosen to pursue the same foreign perspective and the same domestic perspective as Sultan Qaboos, arguing that he would maintain that open-minded diplomacy, and at the same time, he would continue the technological growth within Oman, but trying to preserve its traditions, such as its national dress, its its language issues, and the integration of its historic communities, like the Hindus, the Balochis, and the Zanzibaris. All right, questions, comments, clarifications. Put those in the chat, and while you're doing that, we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. My name is Richard, and I do my Middle Eastern Islamic history class. We meet usually Wednesdays at 7 o'clock. My next meeting will probably be on either the 19th or the 26th. I'm taking 2 or 3 weeks vacation. And I will update Meetup when I know which of those dates I'm coming back on. And there are other groups that are part of History Mostly Ancient discussions, like Asian Philosophy with Jason Peng, that they meet on Saturdays at 7. We have Powerful Women in Dead Languages. In fact, we recently did a Dead Languages episode on Aramaic and on Hebrew. So we're covering a lot of the languages of the Middle East. And we also have our short run series like Ukraine, which we will cover when the war heats up again, probably around May. And so, questions and comments.
So, Richard, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned Oman having influence on Africa, like Zanzibar, and obviously you've done a lot of the presentations. How were they able to capture it, influentially wise, from the Europeans? How did?
Yeah, after defeating the Portuguese, they were able to copy their style of boat construction. So they were able to make their way to those islands and bring the force to bear. The other thing to take into account is that the Portuguese ascendance in Europe was highly contested, right? So while they had that power in the beginning of the 16th century, by the end of the 16th century, when Oman was beginning to become more ascendant, so was the Netherlands. And so the Netherlands and the Portuguese were going to war all throughout the Indian Ocean. And the Omanis were able to take advantage of how the Dutch were behaving, and the Dutch weren't interested in trade with Africa the way the Portuguese had been. So Oman was able to take Portuguese possessions in Africa. The Netherlands was more concerned with areas near India, and so those became the sites of more Dutch presence, and the Dutch were followed by the British. So the Portuguese were never able to reclaim them.
Interesting. Even during the World War II, or even prior to that, yeah, you had spent quite significant time talking about Italian and German interests in Ethiopia and so forth, so on. So that's why I was wondering, why wouldn't the other players like?
Well, by the time that Italians and Germans were involved in the Horn of Africa, it was more Italians than Germans. Germans were further south in Tanganyika, in modern-day Tanzania. But by that time, the Omanis were already under British protection. So there was no ability to colonize because the British would have directly interposed. Patty, I think you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I should have picked this up while you were talking, but it seems like for a very small country in a very volatile area, it's managed to do really well and have a certain amount of cohesive peacefulness even after that British protectorate. And would you attribute that more to a strong identity or wise leadership, or highly skillful international relationship? What do you think? I mean, what's your assessment?
Sure. I would say that, first of all, we have to understand how much Sultan Qaboos did in terms of recovery from the Dhofar War, from the Jabal Akhtar War, the Green Mountain War, all these wars in the 50s and 60s, which thoroughly divided Omanis between traditional and modern, between those that were more interested in a pan-Arab movement than Oman. He really had to cultivate a sense of national identity, and that's what I sort of pointed to with the clothing, where he created a national Omani clothing, created a national Omani curriculum. He integrated the Ibadis at a national level, from the Ibadi religious leaders, if not the Imams themselves, because there's no more Imams. But so he created this national identity, and because he created this national identity and improved people's lives while doing it, showing a clear interest in their development and moving forward, and that he was tolerant of the various minorities within the country. Remember, we've already talked about the Hindus. There's a lot of Christian guest workers who have their religions respected as well. Sultan Qaboos, I didn't mention it here, but he's hosted Benjamin Netanyahu and other Zionist leaning individuals from the United States and so on. He's tried to create a situation where people feel like they have a future, and if people feel like they have a future, they're willing to invest time, energy, and interest.
So is it your sense that I mean, obviously that was skillful insight into knitting them together. Do you know of any historical sensibilities within the original tribes that made up that area that would have fed into that willingness to be tolerant? Because human beings in general, the world over, do not tend toward natural tolerance.
I think Ibadia lends itself to that more easily than other historic religions, in that Ibadia is based on the idea of consultation, and that power can't be expressed unilaterally, which is fundamentally different than a lot of the other places in the Middle East that we've seen, where
So there is that
unilateralism and exclusivism are the dominant modern traits.
So there is that unique cultural feature. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. But it is kind of admirable, but by the same token, I wonder if it would be applicable to a larger geographic and just a larger area in the same area, a larger amount of territory within that same volatile area, it does make one wonder whether it could have happened another way.
Yeah, I think that there are certain countries where it could have happened. I could easily have seen if Saudi Arabia had been united by an Ibadi person as opposed to Wahhabist clerics, that it could happen there, right? There's a lot of the same politics in Saudi Arabia at a tribal level. In fact, the idea of the personal majlis, which is where the leader will meet with common people and hear their grievances, and then give an actual response as to like what he's going to do to fix them. That's a tradition in Oman. That's also a tradition in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudi monarchs have a tradition of listening to the common grievances of people, the personal majlis. So a lot of these tribal things that exist at that sort of more basal level, even before Islam enters the picture, exist in Saudi Arabia. So it really comes down to, this is my personal view, it really comes down to the people involved in the process. And they have their cultural influences and they have their beliefs and perspectives, and how they address these things really matters.
Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, I served there from 92 to 95. I think, one of the keys someone just cited was tolerance. The Omanis are a very tolerant society. The Sultan certainly was. The previous Sultan, I don't know the current one. I assume he is as well. But the Sultan would actually, provide land for people to build a Hindu temple. He had no issues with any Christians holding Christian ceremonies there. The Ibadis are the largest group, but there's a significant number of other versions of Islam there. Several kinds of Shiaism, Sunniism. There are Hindu temples. I think it's partly because Oman has always had a trading aspect to it. They've always, they've had property sort of in Pakistan to Zanzibar. Supposedly Sinbad the sailor was an Omani thousands of years ago, whenever that was, if it actually happened. But they have always looked out to the sea as opposed to back to the interior, like the Saudis and the Nejd. So I think that has been a key part of their sort of cultural ethos in dealing with the world.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. But then again, you could point to Egypt, right? Egypt has always required access to the Mediterranean or to the wider Roman world. In fact, Egypt hasn't been independent, ruled by Egyptians pretty much since the ancient period before the modern period. And it was something we addressed last week. And yet Egypt doesn't have this sort of internationalism that Oman has, and the sort of tolerance that Oman has. Christians have a lot of problems in Egypt the way they don't have it in Oman, despite not being an indigenous community in Oman. So there's a lot to say for the particularities of the thought process and the organizational process, because easily the non-Arab speaking minorities in Dhofar, for example, could have been discriminated against. And in fact, Said bin Taimur did that, right? So you have these different sort of perspectives from different people coming to power, and it's an amazing thing that Oman has managed to become such a safe country. I think it's like the 4th safest country in the world or something like that, and that it's become a country that's really open, because that wasn't necessarily the case in the 1960s. Any other comments, questions?
Do you see any challenges that might threaten the way we seem as a group to be perceiving Oman? Do you see
my fear for Oman is we're seeing an increasing US withdrawal from the Middle East in general. CENTCOM, the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, isn't really doing anything anymore, right? They were coordinating for 2 decades, Afghanistan, Iraq. We had oil, we had battleships and aircraft carriers, aircraft carriers, not battleships. We had aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. We don't have them anymore there. And so the region could open up to a Saudi-Iranian proxy war. And with the United States withdrawing, it means that Oman would basically fall into the Iranian sphere. And Iran doesn't have amphibious production capability, certainly not something that could resist a Saudi tank invasion. So that would be very scary to me, from Oman's perspective, of if a war breaks out between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the United States isn't playing a role. Another piece is that if we look at the rate of growth in Oman over the last 40 years, 50 years during the Qaboos period, its growth rate was strongly tied to the price of oil per barrel, because that's where the revenue came from for all of these expanded ministries, for all of these economic initiatives, for all of these developmental projects. So as we move away from petroleum, it's not entirely clear that the economy is diversified enough in terms of its manufacturing sector, in terms of its service sector, in terms of its communication center and all these other, and its tourism sector and all these other things to make up the shortfall. And so Oman, unless it diversifies even more strongly than it has done, it runs a risk of economic depression if we switch away from fossil fuels.
Interesting. This has just seemed so different from so many of your other programs, although I've been away for a few weeks, but
No, it's
a different sensibility.
No, I mean, it's I think it's you're seeing me on a happy day, right? Because most of my programs are this one killed this one and this one killed that one, and then the government changed and they pursued an economic policy and that was a complete failure, and then everybody went to war again, and
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
so it's a very different story of, oh, and then we have 50 years of peace. So yeah, it definitely has a very different feel, and yeah, I thought it would be a nice way to sort of end, and then also wouldn't leave us in a cliffhanger, because there's no way I could do modern Syria or modern Lebanon or one of these in 2 hours.
Happy Holy Week,
wouldn't work.
everybody. Yeah, and on that note, Richard, I wanted to wish you a wonderful vacation and happy Passover, or I'm not even sure what
Yeah.
the appropriate greeting for Passover
That's
is,
fine.
but yeah, so thank you. It's so nice to be back, and now I'll have to miss you for a couple of weeks.
Yep.
So, Richard, talking about the war, I apologize to interject.
Yeah.
The recent attack on the base in Syria, United States base, do you think it had to be attributed to the fact that we're withdrawing from the Middle East, and the enemies are feeling a little bit more bold, so to speak? And I think the attack was by Iranian Revolutionary Guard, if I'm not mistaken. There was a 4 or 5 infantryman that was injured, something like that. So, I mean, obviously, besides the point that we don't know the fact that we do have bases in Syria. I didn't know that, but just
we have bases in the sense of we have about 2,500 soldiers, U.S. soldiers in Syria. They have to sleep somewhere, so the place where they are sleeping is called a base. But I think that when people think of base in their minds, they think of something that looks like a massive complex, and we have those too, just not in Syria. So I think that, to your question, I think that's absolutely on point. I think a lot of the Middle Eastern countries are under the impression that the United States is not going to be involved in any serious way in the Middle East by 2030. And you can see this all across the board. By the way, the Middle Eastern countries are interacting with each other. I think the clearest one is the fact that Israel and United Arab Emirates have become so close at this point. Not only are they trading, right? The Abraham Accords established relations, diplomatic relations between them, but they were already trading at a high level, just not at a common level. But now they're already integrating economies, they're integrating defense spending, they're coordinating military information. And there's a reason for that, because the Emiratis are deathly afraid of Iran. As we saw when we talked today, we talked about the invasion of the Greater Enlisted Troops in 1971, which is still a point of contention between the Emiratis and the Iranians. And the Emiratis don't trust them. They just don't trust them to be a good partner in the region. And the fact that they have steamrolled Iraq, they have steamrolled Syria, the Emiratis don't see themselves as anywhere near capable to resist invasion like those countries were. But Israel can. Israel's fought them. Not in ground assaults, but they've bombed IRGC positions. They've had a lot of proxy conflicts. So that relationship is deepening. And that relationship wouldn't be deepening if the Emirates had a different security backer. Like the United States or Great Britain. Then you also have Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen against the Houthis, where despite American insistence that Saudis not commit genocide, Saudis just don't care. They just don't care. Because they don't think the United States is going to protect them. They're not going to defend their agenda. And on the flip side, Iran's expansionist tendency in terms of getting in terms of trying to bring Qatar more into its sphere, bring Syria more into its sphere, bring Lebanon more into its sphere than those countries have already been. That Turkey is reaching out as well to a number of Middle Eastern countries and what's called New Ottomanism. All of these policies, all these expansionary policies by the countries in the region are direct results of the United States pulling out. And this is a conversation that I often have with people, is that they think that if America withdraws from the Middle East, that there will be peace. And that's not the case. If America withdraws from the Middle East, different powers will enter that space. And those powers may be more peaceful, and those powers may be more militant. And that's a serious question that we should ask. But the assumption that America withdraws, there's peace is overly simplistic. There's a question as to why would Saudi rejoin Iran? I believe this is talking about the current peace deal that the Chinese structured. The deal that the Chinese structured was for recognition between the parties, and I think that the Saudis at this point don't want a direct confrontation with Iran, and they didn't like the way that Israel was arguing that peace with Saudi Arabia would be able to remove the Palestinian conditions. So I think those two things together were working in that regard. And I think to a lesser degree, there's a desire to reinstate the JCPOA. And so reestablishing relations with Iran could lead to some sort of negotiated settlement on nuclear weapons in Iran. I think that's sort of what's going on. I don't see it as altering the fundamental political dynamic of a Saudi-based alliance in the Middle East versus an Iranian-based alliance and that proxy war continuing. I just see it as a slight wrinkle in that.
Now, the follow-up question on a nuclear proliferation is, due to the fact that Putin is trying to move or will move the tactical nuclear weapon into Belarus, do you think that would change a little bit of, things in the Middle East as well, in Iran, and say, well, look, they're using a tactical weapon, maybe they can ask Russia to move a tactical weapon into Iran as well. So what do you think in that regard, or North Korea in that case?
I don't think Russia cares enough about Iran to give them a tactical nuclear weapon or an intercontinental ballistic missile. There's just no point for them to do it. The Russians have no security interest for which Iran is a forward placed protector. If we're talking about Central Asia, Russia has an incredible degree of latitude there. And if it's not the Russians, it's the Chinese, who the Russians don't trust, but they trust enough to hold the Americans out, which is the big worry that they have, right? Their big worry is NATO. And Iran has no forward position on NATO. So it's not useful. And to the extent that they have a forward position on NATO in Turkey, in Eastern Turkey, that's a long shot, because the Russians have Sochi, and that's more than close enough to launch a missile at Turkey. Never mind that they have troops in Armenia already. So, yeah, I don't see it as being it doesn't strike me as a reasonable play. And if And I would also say that it would make it very difficult for Israel to remain as neutral as it is if Russia gave Iran a missile. Like I think Israel would join the allies in the Ukraine war, and I don't think Russia wants to deal with that because Israel is a disproportionately powerful weight in the military question. So I think there's just no benefit there for Russia to do that. So I don't see them doing it.
At this point, you can expect anything from Putin, but I agree.
No, but like putting weapons in Belarus makes sense. He's trying to press the United States and other strong members of NATO, like the United Kingdom. Hey, look, we told you not to put weapons in Poland because that's really close to us. Well, we're going to show you what it feels like by putting weapons in Belarus. We did this. It's the same with Cuba. When we put missiles in Turkey, they put missiles in Cuba. See, you don't like it when we put missiles close to you. Don't put them close to us. And that's that's what that game is. All right, so I think that sort of closes it out for tonight, and I will see everybody next week. Sorry, not next week. I'll see everybody towards the end of April. Bye.
Bye. Happy Passover. Bye.
And thank you, everybody, for your kind comments.